Hello, everyone. Yet another iPhone video I was sort of naively hoping I would not have to make. As I film this, it is the Friday leading into Memorial Day, where it is, barely cracking 60 degrees and raining here in New York City. I'm also starting next week heading out on my book tour. So on my weather app, I have every single city I'm visiting listed now so I can check the weather, and every single one of them is in the 50s to 60s and raining, which I can only at this point assume is a sign from God that we just don't deserve a holiday weekend, and are engaging in hubris and folly of the highest order as a people to believe that we do. Sorry, my dog, Mona. There will be no hot dogs. There will be no fireworks. There will be no delightful barbecues in the park or on the beach. It's just rain and tragedy weather-wise. But we are also going into Memorial Day weekend with the news that the, quote, great, big, beautiful bill, I refuse to say that every single time I talk about it, has passed the House. I believe it's 215 to 214 vote-wise, a real squeaker, a Democrat-less squeaker, but it's passed nonetheless, which is honestly, I think, a level of rallying and cohesion that I wasn't totally sure the conservatives were going to be capable of getting together, but they did. So everyone who's saying that this will absolutely die in its current form in the Senate, it won't pass, I don't know, man. Crazier things have happened. I think we need to be extremely vigilant. Now, this is an iPhone video, so it is still going to be largely vibes based. I don't have the level of outline that I do for my video essays, but I want to divide this video into 3 parts, as much for my own sanity as for you guys. Number 1 is just anger / ranting / sadness. Number 2 is details and sort of explanation. And number 3 is what do we do? So on the sort of anger / sadness front, if you follow me on my personal social media, I have been expressing a level of kind of personal sadness and despair, because I think that we're living in a political time that is not only really upsetting as an American, or I'm sure anyone who's having to bear witness to our nonsense constantly or be at the receiving end of it. But there's also a feeling of powerlessness that I think a lot of us are experiencing. And I'm really trying to find ways productively to reconcile that feeling of helplessness and frustration with the reality that, as I've said on other iPhone videos, the second we, especially we very privileged people who in my case have a platform, have financial safety, all these things, start throwing up our hands and saying, we can't do anything, this is hopeless, then we're really guaranteeing the worst outcomes. So I've been trying to kind of square that feeling, but I think, and I've been doing, an okay job of it, and a lot of that is oriented toward things like, I'm doing a lot of fundraising in conjunction with my book tour and, other things that feel productive. I'm still volunteering here in our mayoral election, just doing what I can. But I am feeling, and when I asked on Instagram how you guys were feeling, I got a quick survey. I mean, the level of despair people are feeling looking at this bill, I think, is just astronomical, right? Because it speaks not only to a real existential threat, and we'll get into some of the real threats of this bill and why it's so dangerous in the next segment, but there is, I think, this feeling, because many, if not most of us are aware that the standard conservative agenda in America, and really globally, but especially here, is deeply unpopular. What conservatives actually want to do with their power has never been a popular or populist agenda. People don't like tax cuts for the rich. They don't like losing social programs. They like having more of them. And so the fact that the sort of Trump faux populism, MAGA nonsense, whatever, has been able to kind of push through what is on every level a very radical restructuring of a lot of America's tax, economic, and social services policy which, by the way, like Reagan's wet dream, right? Like, this is like a neocon's greatest crowning achievement is what we're looking at. And the fact that there's any level of this is good for the middle class or this is for working people, and that people are eating that up, even when we can see the details of how this bill actually plays out, is very despair. It makes me despair, because it really says that we are dealing with a public that cannot separate out what is just rhetoric and posturing toward economic populism and a working class politic and what is actually beneficial for the working class. And the fact that MAGA has been so successful at convincing people that the average conservative gives a shit about the working and middle classes is like, talk about the greatest deal ever made, the greatest con ever pulled off. So that is really upsetting, straight up. It is also very upsetting that the rhetoric that is often used to push through this kind of agenda of real economic austerity for the working and middle classes, paid for or to pay for extreme breaks for corporations and the wealthy, is not just this faux populism that's mostly based on culture war nonsense. And, throwing, little tiny insignificant wins here and there. It's also based on this constant, never-ending rhetoric about America is running out of money. We don't have enough. We're running up the debt. We need to cut spending. We need to cut spending. We need to cut spending. I want to be very clear about two things with regards to that narrative. Number one, America has plenty of fucking money. We have unprecedented, historical, global historical, unprecedented levels of wealth in this country, wealth and productivity. California alone is now the fourth biggest economy in the world. America has enough money for everyone to be living in a utopia. The difference between the life that we could be living as Americans and the ones that we currently live is that our tax policy, as it pertains to the wealthiest Americans and to corporations, is a sick joke. And people will all the time try and say, we already tax these people enough. They pay so much in proportion to how many people there are. First of all, if you go back and look at the most prosperous time, not in European history, not in South American history, in American history, the most prosperous times for the middle class were in what? The 1950s and 1960s. What was the marginal tax rate in the 1950s under Eisenhower? What did the marginal tax rates on the very wealthiest look like during that time of unprecedented American prosperity for the working and middle classes? Survey says it was the highest they've ever been, in some cases 91%. If someone tried to put a 91% marginal tax rate on the wealthiest Americans today, they would call them a communist and probably throw them in a camp in El Salvador. Let's be very clear about that. But that's American history. So we did used to tax our wealthy much, much more than we currently do. We now refuse to tax them anywhere near the level that they need to be in order to redistribute. There are endless studies, and I'll link some of them in the description, that show that basically every quote unquote impossible social service we want to pay for, we could easily pay for just if the rich paid the actual taxes they owe. Because in addition to our completely insufficient tax code, the wealthy have almost unlimited ways of avoiding paying the even minimal taxes they owe. So I really don't want to hear about how we don't have the money. But even if that were true, this is how you know that Doge nonsense was a scam. If you wanted to actually talk about cutting spending, if you wanted to actually talk about balancing the budget, you know where that money would come from? The Department of Defense. If you want to actually talk about reducing wasteful spending in this country, it is our foreign policy apparatus that is currently essentially the most expensive thing that we do by an enormous margin, and does, as we can tell, does little to nothing to help the many countries that we involve ourselves in the affairs of. And it really shows that Doge was such a joke because they didn't even touch the Department of Defense. You want to talk about really cutting, it's not firing a couple of, special needs teachers in Washington, D.C. It's completely restructuring our approach to foreign policy that currently is just like endless vacuum for the wealth that we are currently able to extract from our wealthiest, which is already too little. But yeah, we have money to pay for forever wars. We have money to pay for a completely bloated and nonsensical Department of Defense, but we can't pay for SNAP benefits. We can't pay for universal health care so that someone doesn't risk going into bankruptcy because they broke their leg and called an ambulance instead of a taxi, right? Okay. So I'm really, these two arguments that the conservatives are in any way economically populist now that it's MAGA, joke. The fact that we can't pay for anything, joke. We pay for plenty of things, but also we could pay for infinitely more if we actually taxed rich people and if the rich people actually paid their taxes. That was the anger and rant part. I'm gonna let that ride. But I do very personally understand how it feels. Those two factors combined can lead one to feel very hopeless and frustrated. But let's get into the practicalities. Much of this bill is just a re-up of the 2017 historical levels of tax cuts that were given to the wealthiest and the corporations in this country. That is the crux of it. That is sort of its major reason for being, is giving even more huge tax breaks to the wealthiest and to corporations. That's first and foremost. The real purpose that we're serving here, the more long-term ideological purpose for conservatives, is dismantling whatever protections remained for, I would say, the poor and working class, I would say the welfare state, but it really goes beyond that and is just any group that they don't like, right? So, for example, we're looking at enormous cuts to SNAP. We're looking at enormous cuts to Medicaid. We're looking at huge limitations on student loans, which, as you know, people were writing in my Instagram inbox, would essentially overnight mean that no one except the very wealthiest could do things like go to medical school. We're looking at essentially having AI replace policy making, especially on the federal level. We're looking at completely dismantling and excluding trans healthcare and rolling back essentially every bit of progress that we've made on that front. We're looking at reappropriating public land and parks for profit. We're looking at dismantling essentially every social program that we can. And maybe the most insulting part of all of this, and aside from the stuff that I mentioned in the previous point, that, you know, we couldn't possibly pay for programs like Medicaid because we have no money, or that this is actually in the interest of the working and middle class, like, obviously there's a huge frustration with that. But something I find very insulting to our collective intelligence, honestly, is the little tiny slivers of red meat that are being thrown to the people who, the working and middle class people who are being encouraged to support this. Because let's be very clear, politicians, rich conservatives, rich people generally, it's not shocking that they would support this. It's pretty much a win-win for them. But if you're someone who relies on any of these programs or would be negatively affected by any of these cuts, which is to say the vast majority of Americans, it's kind of a harder sell. So a lot of what we're seeing in the reporting around this and in the discussion of this bill is we'll focus on things like no tax on tips, for example, which I've spoken about before on the channel several times. It's one of my most infuriating little sort of distractions when it comes to right-wing economic policy making, because on the surface it seems like, hey, you're getting to keep more of your money. Most of tipped workers are sort of lower income, or really rely on those tips for their livelihood. No tax on tips has such an insignificant impact on the overall budget and ability to fund programs like this. So it's certainly not being done in service of any of those ideals. But it's also a massive distraction from what is the actual problem with our current tip system. It's not that you pay taxes on them. It's that business owners and corporations are allowed to pay tipped workers literally pennies because they're being compensated by tips. A tipped minimum wage should not exist. Everyone should have to be paid a living wage. And if you can't afford to pay that living wage, then you can't afford to employ someone. It should not be the responsibility of tips to make up someone's livelihood. And we're essentially the only developed country in the world that has landed on this absolutely awful system that's basically bad for everyone involved. But rather than addressing that in any meaningful way, because if we actually abolished the tip minimum wage and made everyone be paid a fair wage and raised the minimum wage where we're at it, who would that negatively impact? It wouldn't negatively impact people like servers or other tipped workers. It would negatively impact business owners. It would negatively impact these big corporations that benefit from not having to pay their workers fairly. So, of course, we don't actually address the problem. Of course, we just paper over it with no taxes on tips. What a big victory for the working man and woman. Yay. Obviously, it's not. Obviously, it's a distraction. Even if it were great on its own terms, it does little to nothing to actually change people's lives in a sustainable, systemic way, as we're theoretically supposed to be moving toward as a society. So this bill is not shocking because, listen, I think Republicans are, they're many things, but they're not stupid. And they realize that the level of power that they currently have, as fractious and tenuous as it might be politically, is probably not going to come around again for a while. So they got to try and shove everything through that they want to do while they can do it. And if they can, make sure that all of the negative impacts hit when they're out of office, all the better. That's kind of their MO. Make programs more inefficient, less functional, and then blame the programs when they don't work, except the fact that they've been drastically underfunded and intentionally undermined. That's sort of also the thinking behind a lot of this bill, is that we'll give a ton of rich people tax breaks, and then down the road, we'll be able to turn our pockets inside out and say, ooh, sorry, we can't afford to pay for food stamps anymore. We can't afford to pay for Medicare anymore. Because let's be clear, they're not stopping with Medicaid. It's going to come for Social Security. It's going to come for Medicare. These people do not want any entitlement programs to exist because they don't believe that anyone's entitled to them. It doesn't matter if you've worked all your life. In their utopia, it's every person for themselves. And if you didn't happen to save enough for retirement, sorry, babe, enjoy working at Costco until the day you die. That's basically how it works. And if you go into medical bankruptcy because you got sick at the wrong time, sorry, I'll signal boost your GoFundMe. That's kind of their strategy. So we're angry. So we've talked about some of the details. I want to talk about what we do. I cannot stress enough that this is the time to make your representatives' lives a living hell. Republicans have rarely had as much power as they currently do, but they've also rarely been as fractious as they currently are. There are warring factions. There's the fact that, Trump rules his inner circle like Joffrey the Mad King, just like firing and, blasting people out of cannons, and like people come and go, and there's, it's all based on day-to-day loyalty and everything like that. So it's kind of an every man for himself type situation. Also, they are aware of how slim their margins are in the Senate and the House. They are aware of how unpopular a lot of these policies are, because make no mistake, they understand that their policies aren't popular. That's why they focus relentlessly on culture war stuff, to get the attention off of the fact that they want to do stuff that basically no one supports economically. Let's be very clear about that. They're aware that many of their seats are up for grabs come midterms. They're very aware that the American people are angry. They don't even go to their town halls, many of them, anymore, because they don't want to get yelled at. To which I say, let's bring back the stocks. They should get put in the stocks, and they should get rolled into their town halls, and you should be able to boo and tomato them like we did back in the, in medieval times. But they're trying to do what they can to get this through as quickly as they can, because they likely won't have the choice. But the opportunity won't come again. But a lot of them are very aware that it's going to be very unpopular, and their vote is going to reflect on them and may be the deciding factor as to whether or not they keep their seat. That is how a lot of people are thinking. There has never been a more important time to turn the screws on your representatives. Who are your representatives? Who are your senators? Call them, write them, post about them on social media, get other people involved, raise awareness, raise hell, let people know that you do not want this, that their constituents don't support it. If you, like me, have the power of the Karen within you, if you can raise hell in a very specific and effective way, if need be, never has there been more of a time for Karens to rise up. Karens for good. We need you all calling your senators. Host parties where you all get together and you call your reps, harass them, ruin their Memorial Day weekends, make their lives terrible. We need to exert every bit of pressure we possibly can. And this is, again, a time where many identities and groups are under attack, or under threat, are losing their access to free speech. So if you are a person who is able to do these things, who is a citizen, for example, a voting citizen who already has that level of privilege that you can hold your vote over someone's head, use it to good. Is it likely that this bill will not make it through the Senate in its current iteration? I don't want to speculate on that, because I've been wrong before. I don't want to curse anything, but what is clear is that it's not a foregone conclusion. This is very unpopular, and they may be able to shove it through, but they may not. And it's up to us to decide, and now is that time to act. Similarly, when I put up the question on Instagram, I got tons of replies of people who are very scared about their benefits. Please please get your finances in order as much as you possibly can. We need to be acting as though a recession is coming, whether or not it does. We need to be acting as though these programs are possibly going away, even if they're not. We need to be, if we can, involving ourselves in community mutual aid and organizations that help the people in your community, because some of this is just going to come down to people who can't afford to go to the grocery store at the end of the week. But if you are someone who has the ability to save a little more in your emergency fund, to, shore up your cash reserves in case something happens to your job, like, what is very clear is that between the tariff nonsense, this bill, and all of the other stuff that's coming down the pike, it is going to be an economically turbulent time for a while. And it is so important that we put on our oxygen masks financially and then use that, transform that stability into political will. Please end this video. Go check your bank accounts, make sure that your money's okay, make sure that you're doing what you need to do to protect yourself and your loved ones, and maybe you have a few extra dollars left over that you can donate to someone who needs it. Do that, please. And then please get involved politically. Let them know that we're not on board with this, because most Americans, when you look at the surveys, are not on board with these policies. They have the numbers right now politically, but we're a big country and we can make a lot of noise. And that noise starts with ruining politicians' Memorial Day weekends. That is my request to you. It is pouring rain outside and I am preparing for my book launch, so I'm not going anywhere or doing anything. But I will be calling people. I will be calling politicians. I hope you do the same. Happy Memorial Day weekend. Bye, guys.